Most men who take the black do so because they have nowhere else to go. Benjen Stark was everywhere. In the year 280 after Aegon's conquest, Winterfell stood as it had for 8,000 years, ancient, enduring, and cold. Within its grey walls, 3 sons of Eddard's father, Rickard, grew toward manhood, each carved from the same northern stone, but shaped by fate into different men. Brandon, the heir, wore his birthright like armour, bold and bright, and utterly certain of his place in the world. Eddard, called Ned, carried the quiet weight of the second son, steady and dutiful, fostering at the Eyrie under Jon Arryn's watchful eye. And then there was Benjen, the youngest of the 3, born in the year 273, a boy who laughed more easily than his brothers and felt the future stretching before him like an open road. The small folk who served in Winterfell's kitchens and stables would tell you that young Benjen had his father's grey eyes and his sister Lyanna's wild spirit, though perhaps with more sense than either. He was the one who could make even old Nan crack a smile with his imitations of pompous southern lords, the one who'd race Lyanna across the Godswood and let her win just often enough to keep things interesting. Where Brandon commanded and Ned observed, Benjen charmed. It was a useful skill for a third son, this ability to make people like you without threatening anyone's inheritance or pride. But charm, in the harsh arithmetic of Westeros, counts for little when it comes to determining a man's future. Benjen understood this even as a boy. Winterfell would go to Brandon when their father died. The next castle, or holdfast, would go to Ned if some suitable match or opportunity presented itself. And Benjen? The world offered several well-worn paths for men like him. He might marry into a minor house, taking his wife's name and lands, if she were the sole heir. He might serve as castellan for one of his brothers, a trusted adviser with a place of honour, but no real power of his own. He might seek glory in tournaments, or distinguish himself in service to some greater lord. Or, if fortune smiled and politics aligned, he might even be granted a minor keep of his own, some holdfast on the edge of the North's vast territories, where a Stark presence would remind the small folk whose banners they served. These were good options, respectable options, the kind most third sons would thank the gods for. And in those early years, Benjen assumed one of them would eventually be his. There was no bitterness in this, no gnawing resentment. He loved his brothers. He loved Winterfell. He understood how the world worked, and he made his peace with it, the way a man makes peace with winter, by accepting that some things cannot be changed, only endured. Well, the castle itself seemed built for enduring. Winterfell's granite walls had weathered centuries of snow and siege, its hot springs still flowing beneath the ancient stones, warming the keep even when the winds howled down from the northern mountains. Benjen grew up in those warm halls, trained in the yard, where generations of Starks had learned to swing a sword, sat at his father's table, where lords and bannermen came to settle disputes and renew their oaths. He learned to read from Maester Wallace, studied the histories of the North and the greater realm beyond, memorized the sigils and words of every major house from the Wall to Dawn. He was good with a blade, better than Ned, though not quite Brandon's equal, and he had the Stark talent for riding. His father once said he sat a horse the way other men breathed, natural and unconsidered. In the winter town that sprawled beyond Winterfell's walls, the merchants' daughters would blush when he rode past, and more than one minor lord had hinted that a match between Benjen Stark and his own daughter might be arranged if Lord Rickard were amenable. Nothing ever came of these overtures. Not yet, but they hung in the air like promises, like possibilities. Life in those years had a certain golden quality to it, that peculiar brightness that only exists in hindsight, when you know what came after. Brandon was being groomed for lordship, spending more time in their father's councils, learning the careful dance of northern politics. Ned was away at the Eyrie, growing close to Robert Baratheon, and learning honour from Jon Arryn. Lyanna was promised to Robert, a match that would bind the north to the Stormlands and give House Stark powerful southern allies. And Benjen, at 13 or 14, was simply young, with time enough to figure out where he belonged. The north itself seemed settled in those days, prosperous in its cold way. The harvests had been good. The wildlings beyond the wall were always a concern, but no more than usual. The great houses paid their taxes and kept their oaths. King Aerys ruled in King's Landing, and if there were whispers that the Targaryen king was growing strange and cruel, well, such whispers rarely reached Winterfell with much urgency. The realm had its rhythms, and the north kept to its own. But even then, even in those golden years, the wall loomed. It always loomed. You couldn't grow up a Stark and not feel its presence, that immense barrier of ice standing watch over the northern horizon. Every child in Winterfell knew the stories. Night's Watch rangers would sometimes pass through on their way south, grim men in black who spoke little and drank much, and their very presence reminded the North of its oldest duty. For thousands of years, House Stark had supported the Watch, sent men and supplies, and honoured the shield that guards the realms of men. Old Nan told the tales on long winter nights, her withered hands spinning yarn as she spun stories. She spoke of the Night's Watch as it once was, the noblest order in the realm, where younger sons of great houses served with honour beside common men who'd proven their worth. She told of the Night King, the 13th Lord Commander who'd fallen to darkness, and of the Starks who'd marched north to destroy him. She whispered of the others, the white shadows from the long night, creatures of ice and death that the wall was truly built to keep at bay. Most of the servants dismissed Old Nan's tales as fancies meant to frighten children. Even the maester would smile indulgently and suggest that the wall was built by Brandon the Builder to keep out wildlings, not monsters from children's stories. But Benjen listened. Something in those tales resonated with him. Some chord struck deep. The idea that the wall stood for a purpose beyond politics, beyond the petty ambitions of kings and lords, beyond even the survival of any one house or kingdom. It stood because it had to, because someone had to watch. Still, these were abstract thoughts for a boy of 14 or 15, interesting in the way history is interesting, but not urgent, not personal. Benjen's future seemed more likely to involve managing some minor keep or serving as his brother's right hand than freezing on the wall. He attended his lessons, improved his swordwork, flirted mildly with the prettier serving girls, and waited to see what life would offer him. He remembered one particular afternoon in the Godswood, sitting with Lyanna beneath the heart tree while she spoke of her upcoming marriage to Robert Baratheon. She wasn't happy about it. Not really, though she tried to hide her feelings behind practiced courtesy. Robert was handsome and strong, a celebrated warrior already, despite his youth. But Lyanna had heard the rumours. She'd heard about his appetites, his love of wine and women, his booming laugh that could turn into a booming rage. She confided in Benjen because he was safe, because he listened without judgment, because he was her favourite brother, even if she'd never say so in front of the others. "Do you think you'll marry for love, Ben?" she'd asked him, her grey eyes reflecting the red leaves above. He'd laughed at that, not cruelly, but with the realism of someone who understood his position. Third sons don't marry for love. We marry for land or position, or we don't marry at all. That's the way of things. That's a bleak way to see the world. It's the honest way, he replied. Better than pretending the songs are true. She'd fallen quiet then, and he'd known she was thinking about Robert, about the marriage she couldn't escape, about the cage that was closing around her no matter how fast or far she rode. Even then, Benjen had understood that freedom was a luxury, and that those born to great houses had less of it than anyone, despite their wealth and power. The higher you climbed, the more you were bound by duty and expectation. But sitting there in the godswood, with the afternoon sun filtering through ancient branches and his sister beside him, Benjen couldn't imagine that within a few short years everything would change. He couldn't imagine that Brandon would die screaming in King's Landing, strangling himself trying to save their father from the mad king's flames. He couldn't imagine that Lyanna would vanish with Rhaegar Targaryen, sparking a war that would tear the realm apart. He couldn't imagine that Ned would return to Winterfell as Lord, burdened with secrets and sorrow, or that he himself would be faced with a choice that would define the rest of his life. In those golden years before Robert's rebellion, Benjen Stark was simply the third son of Winterfell, a young man of some skill and considerable charm, waiting for his future to reveal itself. He had options. He had time. He had the whole world before him, or at least as much of it as a Northern Lord's son could reasonably expect. The North stretched around him, vast and cold and ancient, and somewhere beyond it, the wall stood, watch over secrets older than kingdoms. But that was someone else's concern. That was for the Rangers in Black, for the criminals and bastards and broken men who'd run out of better choices. Benjen Stark still had choices aplenty. He just didn't know yet that the world was about to take them all away. Robert's rebellion took Benjen's brothers, and left him with a choice he never wanted to make. The war came to Winterfell not with trumpets and banners, but with silence and ashes. One day the world made sense, Brandon riding south to confront Rhaegar Targaryen for stealing Lyanna, their father following to defend his heir. And the next day that world was burning. The ravens brought the news in pieces, each message more terrible than the last. Lord Rickard Stark had been cooked alive in his own armour, while King Aerys forced Brandon to watch, a noose around his neck and a sword just out of reach. Brandon had strangled himself trying to save their father, dying inches away from the blade that might have cut him free. Both died, both murdered by a mad king in a throne room far from home. Benjen was 16 years old when he learned that both his father and eldest brother were dead, killed by the same Targaryen madness that had haunted the realm for generations. He was in Winterfell's yard when the master found him, and he remembered the way the practice sword had slipped from his fingers, how the packed earth had seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The Meister's words had come from very far away, muffled and strange, as though Benjen were underwater and drowning. He hadn't believed it at first. I couldn't believe it. His father was Lord Rickard Stark, Warden of the North, a man who commanded the respect of every northern house and half the southern ones besides. Brandon was 20, strong and fierce and alive in a way that seemed to defy death itself. Men like that didn't simply die, they couldn't. And yet the Raven's message was clear, confirmed by multiple sources, undeniable in its horror. The North had exploded into action after that. Jon Arryn called his banners against the Iron Throne, and Ned came home from the Vale with war in his eyes, and Robert Baratheon at his side. Benjen saw his brother for perhaps a week before Ned marched south again, this time as Lord of Winterfell, this time to fight a war that would either free the realm from Targaryen tyranny or see House Stark extinguished entirely. They'd spoken briefly, formally, two brothers who barely knew each other anymore, trying to find the right words in a world gone mad. "I need you here," Ned had said, his voice carrying the weight of a command that was also a plea. "Winterfell needs a Stark. The North needs to see our banners flying." Benjen had nodded, understanding without needing explanation. At 16, he was too young to march to war, too inexperienced to lead men in battle, but old enough to hold Winterfell in his brother's name. Old enough to represent House Stark while Ned fought to avenge their family. It wasn't the future he'd imagined, but it was the one he had. The war lasted a year, though it felt like a lifetime. Benjen ruled Winterfell as best he could, guided by Maester Wallace and the Castellan, learning lordship through necessity, rather than careful instruction. He settled disputes, managed the harvest, ensured that supplies and men continued flowing south to support Ned's campaign. He grew up fast in that year, shed whatever boyhood remained to him, and learned that responsibility was a cold companion. News came in fragments. Robert's victory at the Trident, where Rhaegar Targaryen fell and the war effectively ended. The sack of King's Landing, where Tywin Lannister's men butchered the royal family and Jaime Lannister killed the king he'd sworn to protect. And finally, the news that shattered what remained of Benjen's family. Lyanna was dead. Not kidnapped after all, not held captive in some tower waiting for rescue, but dead, and Ned wouldn't speak of how or why, only that he'd found her too late. When Ned finally returned to Winterfell, Benjen barely recognized him. The brother who'd left for the Vale years ago as a boy, who'd ridden south as a young lord to fight a war, came home as someone else entirely. Ned's eyes had gone cold, distant, carrying secrets that Benjen could see but never touch. And he'd brought a bastard son with him, a baby boy named Jon Snow, with eyes as grey as any Stark's, and a mother Ned refused to name. The scandal had rippled through the North like a stone thrown in still water. Eddard Stark, Honourable Ned, coming home from war with a bastard son. The whispers started immediately. Some said the mother was Ashara Dane, the beautiful sister of the Sword of the Morning, whom Ned had killed at the Tower of Joy. Others claimed it was some common tavern wench, a moment of weakness during the campaign. Ned said nothing, would say nothing, and his silence only fed the rumours. Benjen had been shocked, not by the existence of a bastard. Many men sired children during war, but by Ned's adamant insistence on bringing the boy to Winterfell, on raising him, alongside his true-born children. When Ned married Catelyn Tully to seal the alliance her father had bought with Riverrun's support, she'd arrived to find her new home already occupied by her husband's bastard. The insult was extraordinary, the breach of courtesy almost unthinkable, and yet Ned would not be moved. Jon Snow would be raised at Winterfell. That was final. Benjen had watched his brother navigate those first terrible months of marriage, seen the way Catelyn's face would tighten whenever she saw the bastard, witnessed the careful distance Ned maintained from his own wife as though afraid to let her close. The brother he'd known, the quiet second son who'd fostered at the Eyrie, seemed to have died in the war and been replaced by this harder, colder version. A man carrying weight that bent his shoulders and lined his face despite his youth. They'd spoken once, late at night in Ned's solar, with only a fire between them, and the truth Ned wouldn't tell. "I can't explain it," Ned had said, staring into the flames. "I need you to trust me, Ben. Jon stays. He's my blood, and he stays." "I'm not questioning that," Benjen had replied carefully. "I'm questioning why you won't tell your wife the truth about his mother. Why would you let her hate you, rather than simply explain?" "Because I can't." The words had come out flat, final. "I made a promise. That's all you need to know." And that had been the end of it. Whatever secret Ned carried about Jon Snow's parentage, whatever promise he'd made, it was locked behind walls that even his own brother couldn't breach. Benjen had let it go, had accepted that the war had changed Ned in ways he might never fully understand. They all carried scars from those years. Some were just more visible than others. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Ned ruled Winterfell with quiet competence, earning his bannermen's respect, if not their warmth. Catelyn gave him a son within a year, Robb, born healthy and strong, with tully red hair and stark grey eyes. The North accepted its new lord and began to heal from the rebellion's wounds. And Benjen, no longer needed as Winterfell's keeper, found himself adrift. He was 19 years old and the last of Rickard Stark's sons. Brandon was dead, ashes scattered to the wind. Lyanna was dead, buried in the crypts beneath Winterfell next to their father. Ned was alive, but unreachable, buried under duty and secrets. Benjen alone remained, the spare who'd somehow survived, and the question of his future hung over him like a sword. The old options remained, technically. He could marry, though the prospect seemed hollow now, a performance of duty without joy. He could serve as Ned's castellan, though Winterfell already ran smoothly without his help. He could seek service with some other lord, though the idea of leaving the North felt like betrayal. Or he could simply stay, a permanent fixture at Winterfell, useful but unnecessary, watching his brother's children grow, while his own life remained frozen in place. None of these futures called to him. None of them felt right. Benjen walked the battlements at night, stared out at the wolfswood stretching dark and vast beyond the castle walls, and felt the weight of purposelessness settling on him like snow. The only bright spot in those years was Jon Snow. The bastard boy was a solemn child, quieter than Robb, more thoughtful, and he looked so much like Ned it was almost painful. Catelyn wouldn't go near him, and the servants took their cue from their lady, treating Jon with correct courtesy, but no warmth. Benjen found himself drawn to the boy, despite the complicated questions his existence raised, or perhaps because of them. Jon was an outsider in his own home, loved by Ned, but accepted by almost no one else, and Benjen understood what it meant to be the one who didn't quite fit. He taught Jon to ride when the boy was old enough, took him into the Godswood and told him stories of their father and Brandon, gave him the attention and affection that Catelyn's presence prevented Ned from showing too openly. It was easier to love Jon than to examine his own stalled life, easier to be the kind uncle than to confront the question of what came next. But the question wouldn't stay buried. With each passing season, with each new child, Catelyn bore, Sansa, then Arya, then Bran, Benjen felt the walls of Winterfell pressing closer. He was useful here, yes. He was loved, certainly. But he wasn't needed. Not really. And the difference gnawed at him. The North needed many things. It needed lords to hold their keeps and collect their taxes. It needed knights to train and warriors to defend against wildling raids. It needed farmers to work the land and merchants to trade goods and maesters to tend the sick. What the North didn't need was another Stark at Winterfell, eating at Ned's table and taking up space that served no purpose. Benjen began to notice things he'd overlooked before. The way Ned's face would tighten when ravens came from Castle Black. Reports of increasing wildling activity beyond the wall. The way the older men in the winter town would mention the Night's Watch with a combination of respect and pity, honouring the tradition while acknowledging its decline. The way the wall itself seemed to loom larger in his thoughts, that massive barrier of ice standing watch over dangers the South had forgotten or never believed in. He was 22 when the idea first took root, walking through the winter town on a grey afternoon and overhearing two old men arguing about the watch. "They're down to less than 1,000 men," one was saying. "My grandson's friend took the Black last year and said half the castles are abandoned now, just wind and ice." "Aye, and who wants to freeze on the wall when there's work to be had elsewhere? Only criminals and fools go north these days." "Fools and the desperate," the other corrected. "Though I suppose there's not much difference." Benjen had walked on, but the words stayed with him. Less than 1,000 men to guard 300 miles of wall. The Night's Watch, which had once been the realm's most honoured institution, reduced to a dumping ground for criminals and cast-offs. And the North, which had always supported the Watch, sent younger sons and supplies to honour the ancient compact, slowly forgetting why the wall existed at all. That night he dreamed of the wall for the first time, dreamed of standing atop it, looking north into darkness that moved and breathed, and feeling utterly, completely necessary. He woke with the dream still clinging to him, and for the first time in years he felt something like purpose stirring in his chest. But choosing the Black meant choosing to never marry, never hold lands, never father children. It meant swearing away every future he'd ever imagined, giving up warmth and comfort and the possibility of a life that was his own. It was a choice that couldn't be unmade, a door that closed forever once you stepped through it. Benjen wasn't ready, not yet, but the seed had been planted, and in the cold northern soil of his mind, it began to grow. King's Landing promised glory. What Benjen found was decay dressed in silk and gold. The summons came in the spring of 286, 3 years after Robert Baratheon had taken the Iron Throne. The new king wanted his great lords to attend court, to show their continued loyalty and strengthen the bonds that had been forged in war. For the North, this meant Ned would need to make the long journey south, and Ned wanted Benjen with him. Not as Lord of Winterfell's castellan or advisor, but as a brother, a companion for the road, someone who remembered the world before the rebellion had torn it apart. Benjen had agreed readily enough. He was 23, restless, and the prospect of seeing the capital held a certain appeal. King's Landing was the heart of the 7 kingdoms, the seat of power where great men shaped the realm's future. Perhaps there would be opportunities there, connections to be made, a path forward that he couldn't see from Winterfell's cold halls. At the very least, it would be a change, and change seemed better than the slow drift of his days. They rode south with a modest retinue, perhaps 20 men in stark colours, moving down the King's Road as spring turned the world green. Benjen had never travelled so far from home before, and he watched the landscape transform with genuine interest. The forests gave way to farmland, the farmland to rolling hills, the hills to the broad fertile plains of the riverlands. The air grew warmer, the accents changed. Even the quality of light seemed different this far south, softer somehow, less sharp than the northern sun. They stopped at River Run to visit Catelyn's family, spent a few days at the Twins, enduring Walder Frey's barbed hospitality, and pressed on toward the capital. With each mile, the King's Road grew more crowded. Merchants, hauling goods to market, hedge knights seeking employment, farmers driving livestock, beggars and pilgrims, and sellswords all flowing toward King's Landing like water running downhill. The sheer number of people was staggering to someone raised in the north's vast emptiness. And then they crested the final hill and saw it, King's Landing, sprawling across 3 hills beside the Blackwater Rush, the Red Keep rising high above the city like a blood-soaked fist. Benjen's first thought was of size. The city was enormous, easily 500,000 people crammed into a space that seemed far too small to hold them all. His second thought was of smell. Even from a distance, even with the wind blowing from the west, the stench reached them. Human waste and rotting fish, tanneries and slaughterhouses, the accumulated filth of a city that had grown too fast for its own good. "Welcome to the capital," Ned said dryly, seeing the expression on Benjen's face. "It gets worse." He was right. Riding through the city gates was like entering a different world, one that bore no resemblance to the songs and stories Benjen had heard growing up. The streets were narrow and crooked, lined with buildings that leaned against each other as though too drunk or tired to stand alone. Sewage ran openly in the gutters. The crowds were thick and loud, shouting in a dozen different accents, and the press of bodies made Benjen's horse nervous. Beggars called out from every corner, children with hollow eyes and missing limbs, old men and women too weak to work. The wealth was there too. He glimpsed silks and jewels, saw litters carrying painted ladies, noticed the gold cloaks keeping a semblance of order, but the poverty was everywhere, impossible to ignore or escape. They made their way up to the Red Keep, the royal fortress that dominated the city's highest hill. Here at least the streets were cleaner, the buildings properly maintained, the guards alert and professional. But even the Red Keep carried a sense of decay, as though the Targaryen madness had seeped into the very stones and couldn't be fully scrubbed away. The throne room still bore scorch marks from the wildfire that might have consumed the entire city if Jaime Lannister hadn't killed Aerys before he could give the final order. Robert received them in that same throne room, sitting on the Iron Throne with all the enthusiasm of a man sentenced to hard labour. He'd grown fat since the war, Benjen noticed immediately. The warrior who'd wielded a warhammer and crushed Rhaegar Targaryen at the Trident had become a bloated, red-faced king who looked uncomfortable in his own crown. But Robert's eyes lit up when he saw Ned, and he bounded down from the throne to embrace his old friend with genuine warmth. "Ned, damn me, it's good to see you. And this must be your brother?" "Benjen, yes. You have the look of a Stark about you." Robert's handshake was crushing, his voice booming enough to echo off the walls. "Come, we'll feast. Tonight, I want to hear everything about the North. Gods know I get nothing but lies and flattery from these southern lords." The feast that night was excessive, in a way that would have fed the winter town for a month. Course after course of rich food, wine flowing like water, musicians playing while acrobats performed, and jugglers spun their tricks. Robert presided over it all from the high table, drinking heavily and laughing loudly, one arm occasionally draped around Ned, in a show of affection that seemed to make his friend profoundly uncomfortable. Queen Cersei sat beside her husband, beautiful as the songs claimed, but cold as northern ice. She smiled when required, spoke when addressed, and otherwise watched the hall with green eyes that missed nothing and warmed to no one. Her children were there too. Joffrey, golden-haired and arrogant, even at 7 years old, and the younger ones, Myrcella and Tommen. All three bore the Lannister look, bright and beautiful, and utterly unlike their dark-haired Baratheon father. Benjen noticed Ned, noticing this, saw his brother's jaw tighten slightly before he looked away. The longer Benjen spent in King's Landing, the more the cracks showed. Robert might have won the throne, but he'd lost interest in actually ruling. He spent his days hunting or drinking or visiting brothels, leaving the daily governance to his council. Jon Arryn, now Hand of the King, did his best to keep the realm functioning, but he was an old man carrying a young man's burden. The small council meetings Benjen occasionally observed were exercises in frustration, with Robert growing bored and irritable whenever anyone tried to discuss actual policy. The Lannisters, meanwhile, were everywhere. Cersei's influence over certain appointments was obvious even to an outsider. Her father, Tywin Lannister, remained at Casterly Rock, but his presence loomed over the capital nonetheless. Lannister gold financed Robert's extravagances. Lannister ships patrolled the narrow sea. Lannister men held key positions throughout the city. The king might wear Robert's face, but increasingly the realm ran on Lannister coin. Benjen accompanied Ned to several social gatherings during their stay, and each one left him more disturbed than the last. The nobles of King's Landing played their games with smiles and wine, speaking in courtesies that barely disguised the knives they held behind their backs. Alliances shifted like sand. Yesterday's friend was today's rival. Everyone wanted something, whether it was land or gold or position, or simply the satisfaction of seeing someone else brought low. He watched a minor lord from the Reach spend an entire evening flattering a Lannister cousin in hopes of securing a better marriage for his daughter. He overheard 2 Crownlands knights discussing which of their rivals they might destroy with a well-placed rumour. He saw a merchant from the Free Cities slip a purse to one of the king's stewards, and knew, without asking, that some law or tax would be quietly adjusted in the merchant's favour. "Is it always like this?" he asked Ned one evening, after another exhausting day of false smiles and empty pleasantries. His brother was silent for a long moment, staring into his wine cup. "Yes," he said finally. "This is how the game is played in the South. Loyalty means nothing. Honor is a word they use when it suits them. Everyone is for sale, and the only question is the price. How do you stand it?" "I don't," Ned replied. "That's why I stay in the North." The Faith's presence in the city added another layer of complexity. The Sept of Baelor dominated the city's skyline almost as much as the Red Keep, and the most devout still wielded considerable influence, despite the Targaryens' attempts to diminish them over the centuries. Benjen attended a service there, curious to see how the faith operated in the capital, and found himself listening to a septon deliver a sermon that was as much political commentary as spiritual guidance. The septon spoke of the realm's moral decay, of how the sins of the Targaryen dynasty still poisoned the Seven Kingdoms. He mentioned, carefully but clearly, how the new king had married a Lannister bride but kept company with whores, how the court wallowed in excess while the small folk starved, how the great lords had forgotten that they ruled by divine right, and would answer to the gods for their failures. It was bold talk, perhaps too bold, but no one moved to silence him. The faith might have lost its militant orders, but it still commanded the hearts of the common people, and that gave it power no king could entirely ignore. After the service, Benjen had walked through the city streets, trying to reconcile the grandeur of the sept with the poverty visible on every corner. He saw mothers begging for bread to feed their children. He saw men crippled in Robert's War now reduced to begging because the crown had no use for broken soldiers. He saw the gold cloaks drag away a thief who'd stolen a loaf of bread, and wondered what justice waited for that desperate soul. That night he found himself in a tavern near the Street of Steel, drinking wine that was better than he'd expected, and listening to the talk around him. The small folk spoke more freely here, away from nobles and their guards, and what Benjen heard troubled him. They didn't love Robert, not the way the songs suggested. They remembered him as the warrior who'd won the throne, yes, but they saw him now as just another king who took their taxes and gave nothing back. The Lannisters despised openly, calling them arrogant and cruel. And the Night's Watch, when it came up at all, was mentioned as a joke, a place for criminals and fools, nothing more. The wall could fall tomorrow, and who'd care, one man said, deep in his cups. What's a wildling raid compared to what we suffer here? At least the wildlings are honest about wanting to rob you. His companions had laughed at that, and Benjen had said nothing, but the words stayed with him. The wall could fall tomorrow, and who'd care? Here in the capital, 3,000 miles from the North's borders, the great barrier that had stood for 8,000 years meant nothing. It was a distant, half-mythical thing, as real to these people as the others, or the children of the forest, which was to say, not real at all. The weeks in King's Landing blurred together into a haze of feasts and meetings, false friendship and careful politics. Benjen played his part as well as he could, smiled when appropriate, drank when required, and kept his mouth shut when the courtiers said things that would have earned them a beating in any honest northern hall. He was a Stark, and the Starks didn't make scenes in the capital. They endured, they observed, they remembered. But endurance had its limits. By the time Ned announced they'd be returning to the north, Benjen felt genuine relief. He'd seen enough of King's Landing to last a lifetime. The city's grandeur was a lie built on foundations of shit and gold, and the court's games left a taste in his mouth like spoiled meat. The night before they left, he stood on one of the Red Keep's balconies, looking out over the city as the sun set over Blackwater Bay. The view was beautiful in its way, the harbour filled with ships, the streets glowing with lamplight, the bay reflecting the dying day's colours. But he couldn't see the beauty without also seeing the rot beneath it, the desperate poverty, the casual cruelty, the slow decay of a realm that had won its war but lost its soul. Ned found him there, appeared beside him without announcement, and together they watched the darkness fall. "I thought it would be different," Benjen said quietly. "I thought Robert would make things better." "Robert won the throne," Ned replied. "He never wanted to rule it. There's a difference. And we fought a war for this. Brandon and father died so that Robert could drink himself stupid while the Lannisters buy the realm piece by piece." Ned's expression didn't change, but Benjen saw the tightness around his eyes, the way his hands gripped the balcony rail. "We fought because Aerys was mad and had to be stopped. What came after? That's a different question." They stood in silence as the stars emerged, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to the affairs of kings and kingdoms. Benjen thought of Winterfell, of the clean northern cold, of a place where words still had meaning, and oaths still mattered. He thought of the wall, standing watch over an empty land, forgotten by everyone who should have remembered. "I want to go home," he said. "Tomorrow," Ned promised. "Tomorrow we ride north." And Benjen rode north with a bitter truth settling in his bones. The realm's eyes were fixed on crowns and coins, while the wall stood forgotten, and somewhere beyond it, in the darkness the South refused to acknowledge, something old and patient was waiting. While lords schemed in kings, landing, something old and hungry was stirring beyond the wall. The journey back to Winterfell took on the quality of a pilgrimage, each mile north stripping away the false courtesies of the capital and replacing them with something cleaner, harder, more honest. The air grew colder. The forests thickened. The people they passed spoke with northern accents that sounded like home after weeks of southern drawls and affectations. Benjen felt the tension he'd carried since arriving in King's Landing slowly bleeding away, replaced by a bone-deep certainty that he belonged here, in these cold lands, not in the snake pit of the capital. They'd been on the road for perhaps 3 weeks, when they stopped at a village just south of the Neck. A small collection of timber buildings clustered around a modest inn. The place was unremarkable in most ways, the kind of settlement they'd passed a dozen times already. But that night, Benjen heard something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. An old ranger from the Night's Watch was there, heading south on some errand for Castle Black. He sat by the common room's fire, nursing a cup of weak ale and looking like winter personified. Grey-haired, grey-faced, with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten none of it. The locals gave him respectful distance, the kind of space you'd give a wounded wolf, and he seemed content with the isolation. But Benjen, curious and still unsettled from his time in the capital, approached the man and bought him a better cup of ale. The ranger, who gave his name only as Yoren, had studied him with those cold eyes, and then nodded slowly, accepting both the drink and the implicit request for conversation. "You're Stark," Yoren had said, not a question. "Benjen, Lord Eddard's brother." "Aye, got the look of Northmen about you both. Seen your brother from a distance at Winterfell once, years back." Yoren took a long drink. "What's a Stark doing buying drinks for an old crow like me?" "Curiosity," Benjen had replied honestly. "I've never spoken to a ranger before. Not properly." That had earned something that might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell under Yoren's beard. Curiosity. Most men don't want to know what we see up there. Easier to pretend the wall's just for keeping wildlings in their place. Is it? Just for wildlings? The ranger had studied him for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, meant for Benjen's ears alone. "I've been ranging for nearly 30 years, boy. Seen things that'd make you piss yourself. Dead men walking. Cold so deep it burns like fire. Darkness that moves when there's no wind to move it. And the wildlings, they're running scared. Not raiding like they used to. Running. Something's pushing them south. Something that's got even Mance Raider spooked, if the talk is true." Benjen had felt the hair on his neck rise. What kind of something? The kind we don't talk about in polite company. The kind the maesters say don't exist. Yoren had leaned back, his eyes distant. "But I've been north of the wall more times than I can count. And I'm telling you true, the land feels wrong up there now. Like it's holding its breath. Like winter's coming. But not the winter you know. Something older." They'd talked deep into the night, and Yoren had painted a picture of the Night's Watch that bore little resemblance to the noble order of Old Nan's tales. Castle Black was falling apart, he'd said. The Night's Watch was down to fewer than 1,000 men, spread across 3 active castles, with the rest abandoned to ice and ruin. The Lord Commander was old and tired, barely holding things together. Half the men were criminals who'd chosen the wall over execution or mutilation. The other half were the desperate, the broken, the ones who'd run out of everywhere else to go. "We need men," Yoren had said bluntly. "Good men, not just rapers and thieves. The kind who understand what we're guarding against. The kind who'd believe me when I say something's coming." What is coming? Don't know. Don't want to know, if I'm being honest. But it's coming all the same. The ranger had finished his ale and stood, moving like a man twice his age. "You seem like a smart lad, Lord Benjen. Do you want my advice? Stay south. Find yourself a warm wife and a warm bed and forget about the wall. Let us old fools freeze in the dark." But Benjen couldn't forget. The conversation haunted him for the rest of the journey home, Yoren's words echoing in his mind like a warning he couldn't ignore. Something's coming. The wildlings are running scared. The land feels wrong. He found himself watching the northern horizon as they travelled, as though he might see some sign of the darkness the ranger had described. When they finally reached Winterfell, the castle welcomed them like a mother's embrace. The grey walls, the warm springs, the familiar faces. All of it felt right in a way that King's Landing never had. Catelyn greeted them formally, her face tight, with the strain of managing Winterfell alone while pregnant with another child. Robb had grown, already showing signs of becoming a warrior like his father. Jon Snow watched from a respectful distance, and Benjen made a point of ruffling the boy's hair and promising to take him riding soon. But settling back into Winterfell's rhythms couldn't quiet the questions that had taken root in Benjen's mind. He found himself paying attention to things he'd previously overlooked. The reports that came in from the northern holdfasts, the talk among the older men who remembered when the watch had been strong, the stories that filtered down from the gift and the villages closest to the wall. The pattern, once he started looking for it, was undeniable. Wildling activity was increasing. Not dramatically, not enough to cause alarm in the south, but steadily, persistently, in ways that suggested something more than the usual raiding. Rangers were going missing more frequently. Strange stories circulated among the mountain clans, tales of cold winds and blue-eyed shadows, dismissed as superstition, but too widespread to ignore entirely. Benjen began spending time in Winterfell's library, such as it was, reading everything he could find about the Night's Watch and the Long Night. Maester Luwin was helpful in his scholarly way, providing histories and accounts, though he made it clear he considered most of the supernatural elements to be metaphor and legend. The Meisters of the Citadel, he explained, had long ago concluded that the others were likely just a particularly savage tribe of wildlings, their reputation inflated over centuries of retelling. The human mind seeks patterns and meaning in randomness, Lewin had said, his chain clinking as he gestured. Ancient peoples, faced with the horrors of a particularly brutal winter and widespread famine, created monsters to explain their suffering. The others, the White Walkers, the Cold Gods, all just different names for the same fundamental fear of winter and death. It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of clear-eyed rationalism that the Citadel prided itself on. But it didn't account for what Euron had seen, or for the fear Benjen had recognized in the old ranger's eyes. That hadn't been a superstition. That had been the look of a man who'd faced something real and terrible, and lived to carry the memory. Old Nan, when Benjen sought her out, had a different perspective entirely. She sat in the hall with her spinning, her ancient fingers moving with practiced ease, and she spoke of the long night as though it had happened yesterday instead of 8,000 years ago. The darkness came in the depths of winter, she said, her voice taking on the cadence of a story told countless times. It came with a cold that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs, with winds that carried voices of the dead. The others rode their pale dead horses, bringing winter with them, killing everything in their path. The Night's Watch fought them at every castle, and one by one the castles fell, until only the wall itself remained. But it's just a story, Benjen had protested, though with less certainty than he would have felt a year ago. Old Nan's eyes, clouded with age but sharp with knowing, fixed on him. Is it? The wall still stands, boy. 8,000 years it stood, 700 feet of ice and magic. Brandon the Builder didn't raise that just to keep out wildlings. He raised it because something had to be kept out, something that had nearly destroyed the world. The Meisters say what they've written in their books, and they wrote those books in warm southern keeps, far from the wall. But we remember. The North remembers. House Stark remembers, even if the rest have forgotten. The conversation had left Benjen unsettled. He wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a very old woman. But he couldn't. Not after King's Landing. Not after seeing how the South had forgotten everything that didn't serve their immediate interests. If they could forget that Robert's rebellion was fought for justice and turn it into just another Game of Thrones, how much easier to forget monsters that supposedly died thousands of years ago. He began taking longer rides beyond Winterfell's walls, sometimes alone, sometimes with a few men from the garrison. He'd ride north, always north, until he could see the wall in the far distance. That pale line across the horizon that never quite disappeared, no matter how far south you travelled in the north. It drew him the way a lodestone draws iron, pulling at something deep in his chest that he couldn't name. On one such ride, he encountered a group of small folk moving south with their possessions loaded on carts. 2 families, by the look of it. Perhaps 20 people. Total, including children. They'd come from a village near the Gift, they said, abandoning homes their families had held for generations. When Benjen asked why, the answer came reluctantly, as though speaking it aloud might make it more real. The village to the north of ours, my lord. Queen's Crown, they called it. The whole place went silent 3 months back. Traders stopped coming from there, so some of our men rode up to see what had happened. The speaker was a grizzled farmer, weathered by hard years and harder choices. Found nothing but empty houses, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Just empty. Every soul was gone, near 200 people, like they'd walked away from their lives and kept walking. Could they have fled south without telling anyone? Leaving everything behind, food on the tables, fires still smoking. And when our men tried to search the houses, they said the cold was wrong. Inside the buildings, my lord, colder than outside, frost on the walls when it was near summer outside. The farmer's hands twisted his cap. We're not waiting to see what happens to Queen's crown. Benjen had given them what silver he carried and directions to the nearest holdfast, then ridden on with the farmer's words echoing in his mind. Empty houses, wrong cold. 200 people left, without a trace. The maesters would find a rational explanation. Disease, perhaps. Or mass hysteria. But Benjen had seen the fear in those farmers' eyes, and he didn't think rational explanations would help them sleep at night. Back at Winterfell, he sought out Ned in his solar. His brother was reviewing the household accounts, the kind of tedious but necessary work that came with lordship, and he looked up with mild surprise when Benjen entered without being summoned. "We need to talk about the wall," Benjen had said without preamble. Ned set down his quill. "What about it?" "It's dying, Ned. The Night's Watch is down to a few hundred men. The castles are falling apart, and something is happening beyond the wall. Something that has the wildlings running scared and villages going silent." His brother's expression didn't change, but Benjen saw the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes sharpened with attention. "What have you heard?" Benjen told him everything. The conversation with Yoren, the reports from the northern holdfasts, the refugees from near the gift, the pattern of increasing wildling activity that didn't match the usual raiding. He expected Ned to dismiss it, to offer the same rational explanations the maesters would provide. But instead, his brother sat in silence for a long moment, staring at something only he could see. "Father used to say that winter was coming," Ned said finally. "Not the season. We all know seasons come and go. Something else. A warning that had been passed down through every lord of Winterfell since the wall was built. Winter is coming, like a prayer or a promise. I never understood what he meant. Not really, though it was just about being prepared, about remembering that hard times follow good. And now? Now I wonder if he was warning us about something specific, something the Starks are supposed to remember, even when everyone else forgets." Ned stood, moved to the window that looked out over Winterfell's yard. "The wall was built for a reason, Ben. The Night's Watch exists for a reason. And for 8,000 years, House Stark has supported them both. That's not a coincidence." "So you believe something's coming?" "I don't know what I believe, but I know the Watch needs men, and I know our house has always answered when the Watch called." He turned back to Benjen. "I'll send word to Castle Black. We'll offer support, supplies, whatever they need, and I'll encourage the other northern lords to do the same." It was the right answer, the dutiful answer, but Benjen could see the limits of it, even as Ned spoke. Supplies were helpful, support was necessary, but they weren't enough. The Night's Watch didn't need charity, it needed men. It needed lords' sons and trained warriors, the kind of recruits that would restore its strength and remember its purpose. It needed someone who understood that the wall wasn't just a dumping ground for criminals, but the shield that guards the realms of men. Over the following months, Benjen watched the ravens come and go, carrying Ned's letters to Castle Black and responses from Lord Commander Quargel. The watch was grateful for the support, the supplies helped, but the underlying problem remained. The Night's Watch was dying by degrees, and no amount of grain or wool could change that fundamental reality. Benjen threw himself into Winterfell's duties, trying to silence the growing conviction in his chest. He helped manage the harvest, trained with the garrison, and spent time with Jon and Robb as they grew. He courted the daughter of a minor northern lord, went through the motions of considering marriage, and found he couldn't summon any real interest in the prospect. She was kind and pretty, and would make someone a fine wife, but Benjen felt nothing except a vague guilt that he was wasting her time. At night he dreamed of the wall. Sometimes he stood atop it, looking north into darkness that breathed and moved. Sometimes he walked its length, seeing the abandoned castles standing silent and empty, monuments to a purpose the world had forgotten. Sometimes he was ranging beyond it, moving through forests of white wood where the snow never melted and the cold burned like fire. He'd wake from these dreams with his heart pounding, unsure if they were warnings or invitations. The decision, when it finally crystallized, came not with trumpets or revelation, but with quiet certainty. He was 25 years old, standing in Winterfell's godswood beneath the heart tree, watching his breath mist in the cold air. It was a clear winter morning, the kind where the sky seemed impossibly blue and the snow sparkled like crushed diamonds, beautiful and deadly and utterly northern. He thought about King's Landing, about the rot and the games and the slow decay of a realm that had forgotten its purpose. He thought about Ned, bound by duty and secrets, carrying burdens that were breaking him by degrees. He thought about Winterfell, which would pass to Robb, and then to Robb's children, the Stark line secured for generations to come. He thought about the wall, standing watch over darkness while the world slept. And he thought about what old Nan had said. The North remembers. House Stark remembers. Someone had to remember. Someone had to watch. Someone had to stand on that wall and believe it mattered, believe the ancient purpose was still real, even when everyone else had forgotten or stopped caring. The Night's Watch needed men who chose the black, not because they had no other options, but because they understood that some duties transcended personal ambition or comfort. Benjen could marry. He could serve as Ned's castellan. He could live a comfortable life at Winterfell, useful and loved and ultimately unnecessary. Or he could ride north to the wall and give his life meaning by standing watch over the darkness the South refused to acknowledge. When he finally told Ned his decision, his brother had looked at him for a long time without speaking. There was pain in Ned's eyes, the pain of losing another brother after having lost so many already. But there was also understanding, perhaps even respect. "Are you certain?" Ned had asked. "Yes. The vows are forever, Ben. Once you swear at them, there's no coming back." "I know." Ned had nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable. "Then you'll go with my blessing and my pride. The Night's Watch is lucky to have you." But later, in private, Ned had gripped his shoulder hard enough to bruise and said something else, something that sounded like grief and gratitude mixed together. "Thank you for remembering. Someone needs to remember." And Benjen understood that his brother carried secrets heavier than he could share, knowledge darker than he could speak, and perhaps some of those secrets touched on the very darkness the wall was built to guard against. But those were Ned's burdens to carry, and Benjen would never ask him to share them. His own burden was clear enough. He would ride north. He would take the black. He would stand on the wall and remember what the South had forgotten, watch for dangers the realm refused to believe in, and honor the compact house Stark had kept for 8,000 years. Winter was coming. Someone had to be ready when it arrived. Choosing the black meant choosing to never hold land, never take a wife, never see his name carried forward, and Benjen Stark chose it anyway. The days between making his decision and actually leaving Winterfell carried a strange quality, like living in the space between heartbeats. Everything was the same. The castle stood unchanged. The routines continued as they always had. The people around him went about their lives. But everything was also fundamentally different, because Benjen knew he was leaving and wouldn't return. Not truly. Not as the man he'd been. Word spread quickly through Winterfell once Ned made the announcement. The servants whispered in corners, some with respect, others with confusion. Why would a lord's son, healthy and whole and with prospects before him, choose the wall? The northern lords who heard the news sent ravens expressing their approval in careful, formal language that couldn't quite hide their surprise. The younger men in the garrison looked at Benjen with something like awe, though whether they admired his courage or thought him mad was hard to determine. Catelyn's reaction was complicated. She'd never warmed to Benjen the way she had to Ned's other friends and family, perhaps because he reminded her too much of the brother-in-law she'd never known, Brandon, the wild wolf who died before she could meet him. But she understood duty, and she understood sacrifice, and when she spoke to Benjen privately, her words carried genuine respect. "You honor your house," she'd said simply, "and you honor the Watch. The North needs men like you on the wall." "The North needs men like me here too," Benjen had replied, "to help Ned, to serve the family. Ned has me. He has his children. He has loyal bannermen." Her hand rested on her swollen belly. She was carrying Arya, though they wouldn't know that for months yet. "The wall has criminals and broken men. You're giving them something they need more than we do." It was perhaps the kindest thing Catelyn had ever said to him, and Benjen treasured it accordingly. The hardest conversation was with Jon Snow. The boy was 6 years old enough to understand that Uncle Benjen was leaving, but too young to fully grasp the permanence of it. They sat together in the Godswood, in the spot where Benjen had made his decision, and he tried to explain it in terms a child could understand. "I'm going to join the Night's Watch," Benjen said. "Do you know what that is?" Jon nodded seriously, his grey eyes, so like Ned's, so like Benjen's own, fixed on his uncle's face. "They guard the wall. They keep the wildlings out." "That's right. And they need good men to help them. So I'm going to go north and be one of those men." "But you'll come back to visit." The question pierced Benjen's heart like a knife. "No, Jon. When you join the Night's Watch, you swear vows. You promise to serve for your whole life, to put the Watch before everything else. I won't be able to come back to Winterfell, not to stay." Jon's face crumpled, tears welling in his eyes. At 6, he was already learning to hide his emotions, already adapting to the reality of being a bastard in his father's house. But this was too much. He threw himself at Benjen, small arms wrapping around his uncle's neck, and sobbed against his shoulder. Benjen held him, feeling his own eyes burn. This boy, who had so little family willing to show him open affection, was losing one of the few people who treated him like he mattered. It wasn't fair, but then, very little in Jon's life was fair. "Listen to me," Benjen said, pulling back enough to look Jon in the eyes. "Just because I can't come back doesn't mean I'll forget you. You're a Stark, Jon Snow, no matter what anyone says. You've got wolf's blood in you, same as me, same as your father. And when you're older, if you want to, you can come visit me at Castle Black. Can you be brave until then?" Jon wiped his eyes and nodded, trying to compose himself. "I'll be brave. Good lad." Benjen ruffled his hair, remembering doing the same thing 100 times before. "And maybe someday, when you're grown, if you find you don't have a place here at Winterfell, there's always a place for you on the wall. The Night's Watch doesn't care if a man's born on the right side of the sheets or not. We only care if he's brave and true." It was a promise and a warning both, the acknowledgement of a truth they both understood, even if they couldn't speak it directly. Jon was a bastard, and bastards had limited futures in Westeros. The wall might be cold and hard, but it was also honest in ways that the great houses could never be. A man's worth there was measured by his deeds, not his birth. Robb took the news with the seriousness of a boy trying to be a man. At 7, he was already showing signs of becoming the lord he'd eventually need to be. Steady, responsible, perhaps a bit too eager to shoulder burdens before he was ready. He sought Benjen out in the armory, where he was checking his gear for the journey north. "Uncle Benjen, why are you really going?" Benjen looked up from the sword he was oiling. "I told you, the Watch needs men." "But you could help Father here. You could marry and have sons of your own." Robb's face was earnest, confused. "Father says you're making a noble choice, but I don't understand why it has to be you." How to explain it to a child? How to convey the growing certainty that had settled in Benjen's bones, the sense that his whole life had been leading to this moment, this choice? He set down the sword and gave Robb his full attention. "Come here." He waited until Robb stood before him, then spoke carefully, choosing his words with care. "Do you know what duty means? Doing what you're supposed to do, keeping your promises. That's part of it. But duty is also about seeing what needs to be done and doing it, even when no one asks you to, even when it costs you something dear." Benjen gestured toward the window, toward the north. "The wall protects all of us, Robb. Every person in the 7 kingdoms, from Dorne to Winterfell. But people have forgotten that. They think the Watch is just for criminals and broken men. I'm going because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to choose the wall, not because they have to, but because it matters." Robb absorbed this in silence, his young face serious. Finally, he nodded. "Will you write to us?" "When I can. Rangers don't send many letters, but I'll try. And when I'm Lord of Winterfell someday, I'll make sure the Watch has everything it needs. I promise." Benjen pulled his nephew into an embrace. This boy who'd be Lord long before he should have to be, if the gods were kind. "You'll be a good Lord, Robb, better than I would have been." The night before his departure, Ned held a small feast in the Great Hall. Nothing as excessive as what they'd endured in King's Landing, but a proper northern celebration with good food and better company. The bannermen who were at Winterfell attended, along with the household knights and the more important servants. They toasted Benjen's health and his honour, spoke of the proud tradition of House Stark's support for the Night's Watch, and tried to make the evening feel like a beginning rather than an ending. Benjen drank more than he should have, laughed at the japies and stories, and tried to burn every detail into his memory. The warmth of the hall, the faces of people he'd known his whole life, the sound of northern voices speaking the old familiar words. He'd carry all of it north with him, treasures against the cold. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone, and only family remained, Ned drew him aside into the Lord's solar. The room was dim, lit only by the fire in the hearth, and his brother poured them both cups of wine from a bottle. He said their father had been saving for a special occasion. "To Benjen Stark," Ned said, raising his cup, "brother, friend, and soon to be a man of the Night's Watch. May your service be long and your memory longer." They drank, and for a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the castle, a door closed. The silence between them was comfortable, the silence of two people who understood each other beyond the need for words. "I need to tell you something," Ned said finally, his voice low. "Something I've never told anyone, not even Cat." Benjen waited, recognizing the weight in his brother's voice. "John isn't my son." The words hung in the air between them, impossible, and yet somehow fitting perfectly into place. Benjen's mind raced. Connecting pieces he hadn't known were part of the same puzzle. John's grey eyes, Ned's fierce protection of the boy, the secret that had driven a wedge between Ned and his wife. The promise Ned had mentioned, the one he couldn't break. "Lyanna," Benjen breathed. Ned's silence was confirmation enough. "She made me promise to protect him, to keep him safe from Robert, from everyone. The world thinks he's my bastard, and it has to stay that way. Robert would kill him if he knew the truth. Because John was Rhaegar's son. The product of whatever had happened between Lyanna and the Dragon Prince, whether it was love or abduction, or something more complicated than anyone would ever know. The last living piece of Rhaegar Targaryen, hidden in plain sight as Ned Stark's bastard. Does he know? No, and he can't know, not ever. As far as the world is concerned, Jon Snow is my bastard son, born of some woman I won't name. Ned's hands were shaking slightly. I'm telling you, because you're leaving, because the Wall is the one place in the Seven Kingdoms where secrets stay buried. And because if something happens to me, someone needs to know. Someone needs to make sure he stays safe. Benjen felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders, another duty to carry north with him. I won't tell anyone, and if he ever comes to the Wall, I'll watch over him. I know you will. That's why I'm telling you. Ned drained his wine. He may end up there eventually, if Cat has her way. She can barely stand to look at him, and I can't explain why without revealing everything. The Watch might be the best place for him when he's grown. It made a terrible kind of sense. Jon Snow, the secret prince raised as a bastard, found his place on the Wall where birth didn't matter, and the only thing that counted was the strength of your sword arm and the depth of your loyalty. There were worse fates, though not many better ones, for a boy who could never be acknowledged for who he truly was. They sat together in silence until the fire burned low, two brothers sharing the burden of a secret that could shatter kingdoms. And when they finally rose and embraced, Benjen felt the last threads binding him to his old life beginning to fray. He was leaving behind more than just Winterfell. He was leaving behind the person he'd been, the futures he might have had, everything except the core truth of who the Starks were and what they stood for. The next morning it dawned cold and clear. Benjen rose before the sun, dressed in simple travelling clothes rather than anything fine, and made his way to the yard where horses were being prepared. He'd take only 2 men with him as escort, and they'd ride light and fast to Castle Black. Everything he needed for his new life would be provided by the Watch. Everything he was leaving behind would stay at Winterfell. The household gathered to see him off. Ned was there with Catelyn, holding young Rob's hand. Jon stood a bit apart, trying to be brave and not quite succeeding. The servants lined up in their informal hierarchy, offering respectful nods and quiet words of farewell. Maester Luwin presented him with a leather-bound book, a history of the Night's Watch, and wished him well in his studies of the order he was joining. Old Nan pressed a small cloth bundle into his hands. "For the cold nights," she said. Inside he found a warm scarf, knitted in grey wool, and a small carved wolf that fit in his palm. "So you remember?" "I'll remember," Benjen promised, his throat tight. He mounted his horse, a sturdy northern gelding bred for endurance rather than speed, and looked down at the faces of everyone he'd ever known. This was the moment. The choice was made, the die was cast, and there was no going back. He could still change his mind, could dismount, tell Ned he'd been foolish, return to his warm room and his comfortable life. No one would blame him, no one would think less of him. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he wouldn't act on it. This was right. This was necessary. This was what being a Stark meant, doing what needed to be done, even when it cost you everything you held dear. "Take care of each other," Benjen said, his voice carrying across the yard, "and don't forget that someone's watching over you from the wall." Then he turned his horse north, dug in his heels, and rode out through Winterfell's gates into the grey winter morning. He didn't look back. Looking back would only make it harder, and the journey ahead was hard enough already. The King's Road stretched before him, empty and cold. Behind him, Winterfell's walls grew smaller with each mile, the castle shrinking until it was just another grey stone kept in the vast northern landscape. The forests closed in on either side, ancient and deep, and the air grew colder the farther north they travelled. They rode for 3 days, stopping at small villages and holding festivals along the way. Everywhere Benjen went, people recognized the Stark colours and treated him with respect. Some had heard he was joining the Watch and offered their blessings. Others simply assumed he was on some lordly business and didn't question further. He accepted their hospitality with grace, knowing these might be the last comfortable beds and warm meals he'd enjoy for a very long time. On the 4th day, they crested a rise, and there it was, the wall, 700 feet of ice stretching across the horizon like a frozen wave about to break. It was larger than Benjen had imagined, more massive, more imposing, ancient, eternal. The work of Brandon the Builder, raised 8,000 years ago for purposes that most of the world had forgotten. But Benjen hadn't forgotten. He rode toward it, with his eyes fixed on that immense barrier, feeling something like awe, mixed with determination settling in his chest. This was where he belonged. This was where he'd make his stand. This was where Benjen Stark, 3rd son of Winterfell, would become something greater than birth or name could ever have made him. The the gates of Castle Black stood open, and beyond them he could see the castle itself, smaller than Winterfell, shabbier, showing its age in crumbling walls and sagging roofs. Men in black moved about their duties, most of them looking exactly like the criminals and broken souls the Watch was known for recruiting. But some stood straighter, carried themselves with purpose, and in their eyes Benjen recognized the same determination he felt. He dismounted at the gate, and a grizzled sergeant approached, taking in the stark colours with raised eyebrows. "Help you, my lord?" "I've come to join the Night's Watch," Benjen said simply. "I've come to take the Black." The sergeant's expression shifted from skepticism to something like respect. "Well then, welcome to Castle Black, lad. Welcome to the end of the world." And Benjen Stark, who'd chosen duty over comfort and purpose over ease, walked through the gates into his new life, leaving behind warmth and family and everything he'd ever known, trading it all for a chance to stand watch over the darkness that gathered in the north. The boy who rode south seeking glory had become the man who rode north seeking purpose. But purpose in the far north came with a price, and Benjen was prepared to pay it. The Night's Watch doesn't care who you were, it only cares who you become. Castle Black looked worse up close than it had from a distance. The walls were in decent repair. They had to be, this close to the wildling threat. But the buildings within showed decades of neglect and poverty. The barracks sagged under the weight of too many winters. The armory roof had been patched so many times it resembled a quilt, more than proper roofing. Even the Lord Commander's tower, which should have been the finest structure in the castle, bore the unmistakable marks of making do with too little for too long. The yard where Benjen stood was packed earth, worn smooth by countless feet over countless years. Men in black moved about their duties with the practiced efficiency of those who knew every task by heart. Some were training with blunted swords, their breath misting in the cold air. Others hauled supplies, or tended to horses, or performed the 1,000 small tasks that kept a castle functioning. Most of them looked exactly as Benjen had expected. Hard men with harder faces, bearing the scars of difficult lives and worse choices. But there was something else too, something he hadn't anticipated. A sense of purpose underlying poverty. These men, criminals and bastards, though many of them were, understood they served something larger than themselves. They might not all believe in the ancient mission, might not think the others were anything more than wildling tales, but they knew the wall needed defending, and they were the ones doing it. There was a certain grim pride in that. The sergeant who'd greeted him at the gate, a barrel-chested man who gave his name as Sir Jeremy Reeker, formerly of the Crown Lands, led Benjen through the castle grounds, pointing out the key buildings. The common hall where the brothers ate. The sept and the godswood, small and poorly maintained, but present. The library, which Riker noted with some amusement, held more books than readers. The armory, the smithy, the kitchens, the kennels where the hounds were kept for hunting. "You'll meet the Lord Commander later," Riker said as they walked. "Corgyle's a decent enough man, though he's getting on in years. Been Lord Commander for nearly 15 years now, holding things together as best he can." He shot Benjen a sidelong glance. "You're Stark, aren't you? Not just wearing the colours, you've got the look." Benjen Stark, Lord Eddard's brother. Riker's eyebrows rose. A lord's brother taking the black of his own choosing. Now that's a thing I never thought I'd see. Most highborn who come to us are doing it to avoid something worse. Execution, mostly, or disgrace. You're not running from anything? No, just running towards something. Huh. Riker chewed on that for a moment. Well, you'll find out soon enough what you've run toward. The wall takes everyone's measure, and it doesn't lie about what it finds. Come on, I'll show you to the recruits' quarters. You'll bunk there until you take your vows. The recruits' quarters were as spare as everything else in Castle Black. A long room with simple cots, a few chests for personal belongings, and a fireplace that didn't quite manage to warm the space adequately. There were 6 other men there when Benjen arrived, all younger than him by a few years, all watching the new arrival with the wary curiosity of those who'd learned not to trust too quickly. Riker performed cursory introductions. Dorion was a singer from the Reach who'd been caught in the wrong woman's bed, the wrong woman being a lord's daughter who neglected to mention she was betrothed. Halder was a blacksmith's apprentice from a village near White Harbour, sent to the wall after killing a man in a tavern brawl he swore was self-defense. Pipar was a thief from King's Landing, quick-fingered and quick-witted, who'd chosen the black over losing his hands. The others gave names, but little else, and Benjen didn't press. "You'll train with the others," Riker said. "Doesn't matter if you can already fight. Everyone learns the Watch's way. See, Alistair Thorne runs the training yard, and he's not gentle. But he's thorough, and you'll be better for it when you range beyond the wall." He paused at the door. "Get settled. My evening meal is at sunset. Don't be late." After he left, the other recruits studied Benjen with varying degrees of interest. It was Pipar who finally broke the silence, his King's Landing accent marking him as clearly as a brand. "Stark," he said. "As in House Stark of Winterfell." "That's right. What's Stark doing here? I mean, no offence, but you lot are Wardens of the North. Couldn't you find a better posting?" Benjen set his pack down on an unclaimed cot. "The Watch needs men. I'm a man." Seemed straightforward enough. "Most men who say that are lying through their teeth," Darion observed, his voice carrying the trained modulation of a singer. "Usually they're here because they murdered someone important or got caught stealing from the wrong person. You actually want to be here?" "I do." The silence that followed was skeptical, but Benjen didn't elaborate. He'd learned in his years at Winterfell that some truths were too complicated to explain to strangers, and his reasons for joining the Watch fell squarely into that category. Let them think him mad, or idealistic, or running from something. The truth would reveal itself in time, or it wouldn't. Either way, talking about it wouldn't change anything. That first night at Castle Black set the pattern for the weeks that followed. The evening meal was plain, but substantial. The Watch might be poor, but it fed its men well enough. Benjen ate with the other recruits, listening to their conversations, learning the hierarchy and politics of this small, isolated world. The Sworn brothers sat at separate tables, and there was a clear divide between the officers. The Lord Commander, the First Ranger, the First Builder, the First Steward, and the common brothers. But there was also a levelling that didn't exist in the wider world. Here, a former lord's son sat next to a former pig farmer, and both were simply brothers of the Watch. Training began the next morning, and Benjen quickly learned that Sir Alistair Thorne was everything Riker had suggested, and worse. The Master-at-Arms was a bitter man, his face permanently set in a scowl, his voice sharp with contempt for the recruits under his command. He'd been a Targaryen loyalist during Robert's rebellion, Benjen learned, and had chosen the wall over execution after Aerys fell. the choice had left him angry at the world and determined to make everyone around him suffer for it. "So the High Lord has graced us with his presence," Thorn said when Benjen joined the others in the yard. "Let's see if you can fight as well as you can wear fancy clothes." Benjen said nothing, simply took the practice sword offered and faced the opponent Thorn indicated, a stocky recruit named Rast, who had at least 50 pounds on him. The bout was short and brutal. Benjen won, his Winterfell training showing through, but Thorn found a dozen things to criticize anyway. His footwork was sloppy. His guard was too high. He relied too much on speed and not enough on strength. On and on, until Benjen understood that Thorn wasn't teaching so much as punishing, using the training yard as an outlet for his own bitterness. But Benjen endured. He'd come to the wall knowing it would be hard, and a harsh master-at-arms was the least of the challenges he'd face. He trained every day, fighting about afterboot, learning to adjust his style to Thorn's exacting standards. He trained with sword and spear, with bow and knife, in full armor and without. He learned to fight on ice, on snow, in conditions that would have seemed impossible at Winterfell. The other recruits began to respect him, not for his birth, but for his skill and his willingness to endure Thorn's abuse without complaint. Daron, who proved surprisingly capable with a blade, despite his singer's hands, became something like a friend. Piper, whose quick wit masked a sharp intelligence, started seeking Benjen out for conversation. Even Holder, who was slow to trust anyone, gradually warmed to the Stark, who didn't act like he was better than everyone else. The weeks blurred into months. Winter deepened, and the cold became a constant companion, the kind of cold that made Winterfell's courtyard seem almost balmy by comparison. Benjen learned to wrap his hands before training to prevent frostbite, learned which layers of clothing provided the best warmth without restricting movement, learned to sleep through the howling wind that swept down from the wall and rattled the shutters of the barracks. He also learned the reality of the Night's Watch from the inside. The organization was even more depleted than he'd realized. Castle Black housed perhaps 300 men, with another 400 split between the Shadow Tower to the west and Eastwatch by the Sea to the east. That left 17 castles along the wall completely abandoned, empty shells slowly succumbing to ice and time. The brothers who remained were stretched impossibly thin, trying to patrol and maintain 300 miles of wall with fewer than 1,000 men. Lord Commander Corgal called the recruits to his chambers one evening, perhaps 2 months after Benjen's arrival. The Lord Commander was an old man, his face deeply lined, his hands trembling slightly with palsy. But his eyes were still sharp, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime commanding respect. "You've all been here long enough now to understand what we are," Corgal said, his gaze moving across each recruit in turn. "We're not the watch of the songs and stories. We're not the heroes who stood against the others in the long night. We're just men, trying to do an impossible job with impossible resources. But we do it because someone has to, because the wall won't guard itself, and the realm won't wake up one morning and suddenly remember why we exist." He paused, letting his words sink in. "In a few weeks, you'll have the opportunity to take your vows, to swear your life to the Night's Watch and become brothers in truth. Some of you will do it, because you have no choice. It's the black or the noose, the black or the dungeons. But some of you might actually believe in what we do here, might understand that this isn't just about keeping wildlings in their place. It's about holding the line against chaos, against the darkness that would swallow the realm if we weren't here to stop it. His eyes found Benjen's. You're Stark. You come from a family that supported the Watch for thousands of years. Your house remembers even when the rest of the realm forgets. I'm glad you're here, boy. We need men like you. Men who choose the black because they believe in something larger than themselves. After the meeting, as Benjen walked back to the barracks through the cold night air, he found himself intercepted by a tall, lean man with a weathered face and keen eyes. The man wore the black cloak of a ranger, and something about the way he moved suggested long experience beyond the wall. Benjen Stark, I'm Corin Halfhand. He raised his right hand, showing the missing fingers that had earned him the name. Lost these to a wildling axe about 10 years back, still managed to fight well enough with what's left. Benjen had heard of Corin Halfhand, one of the Watch's most skilled rangers, a man who'd survived more journeys beyond the wall than almost anyone living. An honor to meet you, Corin. Walk with me. They climbed the wall, using the ancient wooden cage that creaked and groaned as it hauled them up those 700 feet of ice. The view from the top stole Benjen's breath. The world spread out in every direction, vast and empty and unutterably beautiful. To the south, he could see the lights of Castle Black, and beyond them, the dark mass of the haunted forest stretching toward Winterfell. To the north, there was only darkness and snow and the wild lands that had never known a lord's rule. This is what we guard, Corin said quietly. Not the realm of politics and games, not the Iron Throne or the great houses. We guard the boundary between civilization and chaos, between the world of men and whatever lies beyond it in the darkness. Do you believe the old stories about the others, the long night? Corin was silent for a long moment, staring out into the northern night. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen things that don't fit in the Maester's neat explanations. Cold that moves against the wind. Shadows that walk when there's no one casting them. Dead men whose bodies have been missing for days, suddenly standing up and trying to kill you. He glanced at Benjen. I don't know if the others are real, but I know something's out there, something old and patient and waiting. And I know the wall is all that stands between it and the realm. The wildlings feel it too, don't they? That's why they're pushing south. Mance Raider gathers them, all the clans and tribes, bringing them together in numbers we've never seen before. He's not doing it for conquest. He's doing it because they're afraid of something worse than us. Something that makes even the free folk want to be on the southern side of the wall. They stood in silence, two men contemplating the darkness and what it might hold. Finally, Corin turned to him with an expression that might have been approved. You made the right choice coming here, Stark. The Watch needs men who understand what we're really protecting. When you take your vows, request to be a ranger. I'll make sure you're assigned to my party. I'll teach you what you need to know to survive out there. I'd be honored. Honor's got nothing to do with it. You've got the skills and the sense, and we need both. The rest is just practicality. The night Benjen took his vows arrived in late autumn, as the year turned toward winter proper. 8 recruits stood before the heart tree in Castle Black's small godswood, those who worshipped the old gods and wanted to swear their oaths before the weirwood, rather than in the sept. The tree was ancient and gnarled, its face carved with features that seemed to watch with sad, knowing eyes. Lord Commander Corgyle stood before them, holding a candle against the darkness. The words of the oath had been spoken for thousands of years, passed down through countless generations of men who'd sworn their lives to the wall. "Repeat after me," Corgyle said, and his voice seemed to echo in the cold air. "Night gathers, and now my watch begins." "Night gathers, and now my watch begins," Benjen repeated along with the others, feeling the weight of each word settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "It shall not end until my death. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, father no children." The finality of it struck Benjen as he spoke the words. No wife, no land, no children. Everything he'd given up crystallized in a single sentence. He thought of the daughter of that northern lord he'd briefly courted, wondering if she'd found someone else by now. I hoped she had. Hoped she'd be happy in a way he never could have made her. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. The words resonated with something deep in Benjen's chest. Yes, this was what he'd come for. Not glory, not recognition, but the simple truth of standing watch against the darkness while the world slept. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. Each phrase built upon the last, creating a tapestry of purpose that transcended individual ambition. The shield that guards the realms of men. Not the North specifically, not House Stark or Winterfell, but all of humanity. Every man, woman, and child who lived south of the wall, whether they knew it or not, whether they appreciated it or not. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come. The vows were sworn. The candle was extinguished, and Benjen Stark ceased to exist as a separate entity with his own future, and became instead a brother of the Night's Watch, one small part of a larger whole that had endured for 8 millennia. Afterward, there was a modest feast. Nothing elaborate, but the Watch celebrated its new brothers with what it had. Benjen sat with Darion and Pipar, now all of them sworn men, and felt a strange mixture of loss and fulfillment. He'd closed a door on his old life, but he'd opened another onto something that felt more true, more necessary than anything he'd left behind. Over the following months, Benjen began his training as a ranger under Corin Halfhand's guidance. This was different from the basic combat training all recruits received. This was about survival in the harshest environment in Westeros, about reading signs in the snow and knowing when to fight and when to run. Corin taught him how to move silently through the haunted forest, how to hide his tracks, how to find water in winter when everything was frozen, and how to build a shelter that might keep you alive through a blizzard. They made short-ranging expeditions at first, never going more than a few miles from the wall. Benjen learned to recognize the different types of wildling camps, to distinguish between raiders and refugees, to understand the complex politics of the free folk. He learned which plants were edible and which would kill you. I learned to listen to the forest, to hear the warnings in bird song and wind. The first time he killed a man, it was a wildling raider who'd attacked their patrol. The fight was quick and brutal. No honor, no glory, just survival. Benjen's sword found the man's throat, and he died choking on his own blood, eyes wide with surprise. Afterward, Benjen vomited into the snow while Corin stood watch, saying nothing, letting him process the reality of what he'd just done. "It doesn't get easier," Corin said when Benjen had recovered. "Anyone who tells you it is either lying or broken, but you learn to carry it, to understand that sometimes killing is necessary, even when it's not easy." He was just trying to survive, trying to get south of the wall. Maybe. Or maybe he was going to raid some village and carry off women and children. We'll never know now. Corin helped him to his feet. "The wildlings aren't monsters, Stark, but they're not innocent victims either. They're people, same as us, trying to survive in a hard land. Sometimes that means we have to kill each other. That's the price of the wall." Benjen carried that first kill with him, adding it to the weight he'd already been bearing. But he didn't let it stop him. Couldn't let it stop him. The watch needed rangers, and he'd sworn to be one, and that meant accepting the hard necessities that came with the role. He ranged farther as his skills improved, went on longer expeditions, spent weeks beyond the wall, learned to survive on almost nothing. He earned the respect of the other rangers through competence rather than birth, and proved himself capable of enduring the same hardships they faced without complaint or special treatment. His name stopped being Stark and became simply Benjen, one brother among many. The years passed in a rhythm of ranging and returning, of winters at Castle Black and expeditions into the wild. Benjen rose through the ranks, not through ambition, but through simple attrition. Good rangers died or grew too old to serve, and those who remained moved up to fill the gaps. He became a senior ranger, then a leader of his own patrols, teaching new recruits the lessons Corin had taught him. He was 30 when Lord Commander Corgyle died in his sleep, worn out by years of trying to hold together an institution that the realm had abandoned. The choosing of a new Lord Commander was complicated politics, with various factions supporting different candidates, but Benjen stayed out of it. He voted for Jeor Mormont, the Lord of Bear Island who'd taken the Black after passing his seat to his son, and was satisfied when Mormont won. The Old Bear, as he was called, was competent and practical, the kind of leader the Watch needed. By the time Benjen was 35, he'd become First Ranger, the position he'd never sought, but had somehow earned through years of service and survival. It was a role that carried weight. The First Ranger led the ranging parties, made decisions about where to scout and when, reported directly to the Lord Commander about wildling movements and threats beyond the wall. It was also a role that kept him ranging more than ever, spending most of his time in the wild rather than in the relative comfort of Castle Black. He didn't mind. The wild had become his home, in ways that Winterfell never quite had been. Out there, beyond the wall, things were simpler. You survived, or you died. You found food and shelter, or you froze. The politics and games of the realm seemed distant and unimportant when you were tracking wildlings through the Frostfangs, or making camp in the haunted forest while snow fell thick enough to bury you. The other rangers looked to him with respect that had nothing to do with his birth, and everything to do with the fact that he'd kept more of them alive than anyone else could have. He knew the land beyond the wall better than almost anyone, knew where to find the wildling camps, which passes were safe and which were death traps, where the ice was thin and where it would hold. He'd fought wildlings and talked with wildlings, had learned their language well enough to negotiate when negotiation was possible, and fight when it wasn't. But through all of it, through all the years and all the ranging, Benjen never forgot why he'd come to the wall. The stories Yoren had told him, the warnings about something stirring in the far north, stayed with him. And as the years passed, as he ranged farther and farther from the wall, he began to see signs that the old ranger had been right. The wildlings were more desperate each season, pushing south with increasing urgency. Villages beyond the wall stood empty, abandoned without explanation. The northern forests felt wrong sometimes, too quiet or too loud, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Rangers went missing more frequently, and when their bodies were found, if they were found, they sometimes bore wounds that didn't make sense, or were positioned in ways that suggested they'd been running from something rather than fighting it. Benjen reported these observations to Lord Commander Mormont, and the old bear listened with the seriousness the subject deserved. But what could they do? The watch was down to fewer than 1,000 men now, barely enough to man 3 castles, let alone investigate every strange occurrence beyond the wall. They noted the patterns, prepared as best they could, and kept watching, because that was what the Night's Watch did. They watched. They endured. They stood their ground while the world forgot they existed, while the realm descended into its petty games and power struggles, while seasons turned and years passed, and the ancient purpose of the wall faded into legend. Benjen Stark, who'd once been the 3rd son of Winterfell with the whole world before him, had found his place on the wall, not as a martyr or a hero, but as a man doing the necessary work, standing watch over the darkness, remembering what the South had forgotten. He was 41 years old, first ranger of the Night's Watch, and he'd never regretted his choice. Not when the cold bit deep enough to crack stone, not when brothers died and there weren't enough men to replace them, not when ranging parties came back with stories that made no sense and fears they couldn't articulate. He'd chosen the black, he'd sworn the vows, he'd become exactly what he'd set out to be, the watcher on the walls, the shield that guards the realms of men. And in 298 after Aegon's conquest, when word reached Castle Black that King Robert Baratheon was coming north to visit Winterfell, and that Lord Eddard Stark might soon be named Hand of the King, Benjen prepared for one last ranging before his brother's life changed forever. He didn't know it would be his last. Didn't know that the darkness he'd been watching for all these years was finally ready to move. Didn't know that the ancient enemy, the thing that had slept for 8,000 years, was waking at last. All Benjen Stark knew was that duty called him north, as it always had, as it always would, until his watch ended. So he gathered his rangers, checked his gear, and prepared to ride beyond the wall one more time, into the frozen waste where winter never truly ended, and the night was always watching. The Night's Watch had become his family. The wall had become his home. And whatever waited in the darkness beyond, Benjen Stark would face it, as he'd faced everything else, with courage, with competence, and with the quiet certainty that someone had to watch, even when no one else remembered why. When Benjen Stark rode out on his final ranging, he was searching for answers. He found only winter. The raven from Winterfell arrived at Castle Black in the late summer of 298, bearing news that would reshape the 7 kingdoms, though no one knew it yet. King Robert Baratheon was riding north to visit his old friend Ned Stark, and rumour suggested he would ask Ned to serve as Hand of the King. It was the kind of political development that might have mattered to Benjen once, when he'd been the third son of Winterfell with a stake in the realm's affairs. Now, wearing the black and having sworn away all allegiances except to the Watch, it should have been just another piece of news from a world he'd left behind. But it wasn't. Because Robert coming north meant Ned would likely go south, and if Ned went south as Hand, he'd take his household with him. That meant Winterfell would stand nearly empty for the first time in the living memory. More importantly, it meant Jon Snow might finally have the opportunity to come to the Wall, to escape Catelyn's cold stares and find a place where his birth wouldn't define him. Benjen had been thinking about Jon more frequently in recent months. The boy would be 14 now, nearly a man grown, and the bastard's place at Winterfell had never been secure. Ned's secret, that Jon was actually Lyanna's son by Rhaegar Targaryen, remained locked away, known only to Ned and Benjen, and perhaps a handful of others who'd been at the Tower of Joy. For everyone else, Jon was simply Ned Stark's bastard, a permanent reminder of his lord's one supposed lapse in honour. The Night's Watch would be perfect for Jon. Here, his birth wouldn't matter. Here, he could rise as far as his abilities would take him. Here, he'd be safe from Robert's wrath if the truth ever came out. Benjen had been preparing for years for the possibility that Jon might take the black, watching and waiting for the right moment. Perhaps that moment was finally approaching. But personal considerations, however important, couldn't distract from the more pressing concerns beyond the Wall. In the weeks leading up to the Raven's arrival, reports had been filtering back from ranging parties with increasing frequency, and all of them painted a disturbing picture. Wildling activity had surged dramatically. Entire villages north of the Wall stood empty. Their inhabitants vanished without trace. The free folk were gathering under Mance Rayder's leadership, in numbers the Watch hadn't seen in living memory, and their movement had the character of a migration rather than a raid. They were running from something. Benjen had seen it himself on his last ranging 2 months prior. They'd come across a wildling camp that had been abandoned in haste, fires still smouldering, food left uneaten, valuable furs and weapons scattered on the ground. Free folk were hard people who wasted nothing, yet here they'd fled so quickly they'd left survival supplies behind. That alone was troubling. What was worse were the marks they'd found at the edge of the camp, strange symbols carved into the trees, spirals and circles in patterns that had no meaning Benjen could determine. "They're scared," Corin Halfhand had said, studying the abandoned camp with the careful attention he gave everything. The old ranger had grown even more weathered over the years, his face like leather left too long in the sun, but his eyes remained sharp. Not just cautious, not just careful, scared enough to abandon everything and run. Scared of what? That's the question, isn't it? They'd tracked the wildlings south, following their trail until it joined with others, all flowing toward the Wall like water running downhill. Mance was gathering them somewhere in the Frostfangs. That much seemed certain. But why? And why now? Lord Commander Mormont had called a meeting of his senior officers after that ranging. The old bear sat in his chair in the common room, his raven perched on his shoulder, muttering corn at intervals, and his face bore the weight of someone who'd seen too many concerning signs to ignore. "The wildlings are coming," Mormont had said without preamble. Not raiders, all of them. Every clan, every tribe, gathered under Mance Raider's banner. We estimate at least 30,000, possibly more. The number had drawn sharp intakes of breath from around the table. 30,000 wildlings, and the Night's Watch could muster fewer than 1,000 to oppose them. "They're not coming to raid," Benjen had added. "They're running. Something's pushing them south." "What?" Sir Jeremy Rika had asked. "The others?" His tone carried just enough skepticism to make it clear he thought such talk was superstition. "I don't know," Benjen had admitted. "But I've ranged beyond the wall for 20 years, and I've never seen the free folk this desperate. They're abandoning their homes, their territories, everything they've fought to hold for generations. They wouldn't do that for anything less than mortal terror." Mormont nodded slowly. "Which means we need to know what's really happening out there. Benjen, I want you to lead a ranging. Take your best men. Go as far north as you can safely manage. Find out what's driving the wildlings south, and find out if there's any truth to these old stories about the others returning. That could take weeks, possibly months. I know. But we need information more than we need one more ranger at Castle Black. The Watch was founded to stand against the darkness, but we can't fight what we don't understand." That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, Benjen had been preparing for the ranging, selecting men, and gathering supplies. He'd chosen 6 rangers to accompany him. Veterans all. Men who'd survived enough winters beyond the wall to know when to fight and when to hide. Among them was a young ranger named Waymar Royce, a lordling from the Vale who'd only recently joined the Watch but had shown promise. Benjen had hesitated about including someone so inexperienced, but Royce had skills they might need, and the kind of persistence that could make the difference between success and failure. The night before they were set to depart, word reached Castle Black that King Robert's party had arrived at Winterfell. Benjen stood on the wall and looked south, knowing his brother was hosting the king who'd started a war for a lie, the man who'd taken the throne and promptly forgotten how to rule. He thought about riding south before the ranging, about visiting Winterfell one last time, about seeing Jon and Ned and the castle that had been his home. But he didn't. The vows were clear. "I shall live and die at my post." He'd left Winterfell 16 years ago, and that door had closed behind him. His place was here now, on the wall and beyond it, doing the work no one else would do. Thinking about home, Corin appeared beside him, moving with the silence that made him so effective as a ranger. "Thinking about duty," Benjen replied. "Home is complicated. Duty is simple." "Simple doesn't mean easy." "No, but at least you know where you stand." They stood in silence, 2 men who'd given their lives to the Watch, looking south toward the lights of civilization and north toward the darkness they were sworn to guard against. Somewhere out there, beyond the wall's edge, something old and terrible was moving. Benjen could feel it in his bones, the way you could feel a storm coming before you saw the clouds. "You think we'll find them?" Corin asked quietly. "The others." "I think we'll find something. Whether it's the others, or just wildlings, or something else entirely. That's what we're going to discover. And if it is the others, if the old stories are true." Benjen turned to look at his old friend, at the man who'd taught him everything about surviving beyond the wall. "Then we report back, and the Watch prepares as best it can. That's all we can do. Watch and warn. That's what we're for." The ranging party departed Castle Black at first light, riding out through the gate while their brothers watched from the walls. 7 men in black, heading north into a land that might kill them before they found any answers. The wildlings called them crows, and the name was apt. Scavengers picking at the edges of a dying world, trying to find meaning in the scraps they discovered. They rode through the Gift first, that 50-mile stretch of abandoned farmland that had once supported the Watch, but now stood empty except for a few stubborn holdouts. Even here, close to the wall's shadow, Benjen could see the signs of decline. Fields that should have been planted lay fallow. Barns that should have been fully sagged under their own weight. The few small folk they encountered looked at the rangers with a mixture of respect and pity, honouring the black while clearly thinking them fools for wearing it. North of the Gift lay the haunted forest, that vast woodland that stretched for hundreds of miles beyond the wall. Ancient trees grew thick here, their branches intertwining overhead to block out much of the sun. Snow lay on the ground, even in late summer, and the cold was sharp enough to make breath steam and fingers ache. This was the kind of land that broke soft men, that killed the unprepared and humbled the proud. But Benjen wasn't soft or unprepared. He knew these woods, had ranged through them dozens of times, and he led his party with the confidence of long experience. They moved carefully, watching for wildling scouts, checking their back trail, making cold camps that produced no smoke to give away their position. Every ranger knew that beyond the wall, you were prey as much as predator, and survival meant never forgetting that basic truth. They found the first abandoned wildling camp 3 days out from Castle Black. This one had been empty for weeks, maybe months, but it showed the same pattern Benjen had seen before. Hasty departure, supplies left behind, signs of fear rather than planning. They pressed on. The second camp was fresher, abandoned perhaps a week ago. Here they found something new. The bodies of 2 wildlings, a man and a woman, lying frozen in the snow. They hadn't died of cold or starvation. They'd been killed, their throats torn out, their bodies pale and bloodless, as though something had drained them dry. What could do this? Waymar Royce asked, his young face pale as he studied the corpses. Wildlings, maybe, one of the older rangers suggested. Some dispute over who leads or where to go. But Benjen didn't think so. The wounds were wrong for that, too savage, too complete, and the bodies were positioned oddly, as though they'd been running, and something had caught them from behind. He ordered the corpses burned, a precaution that felt necessary, even if he couldn't quite articulate why, and they moved on. The farther north they travelled, the stranger things became. The forest grew quieter, the usual sounds of wildlife fading, until the only noise was the wind through the trees and the crunch of snow under their horses' hooves. The rangers grew tense, hands straying to their weapons, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Even the horses seemed nervous, their ears laid back, their nostrils flaring, as though they smelled something that frightened them. They found more abandoned camps, more bodies, though not many. The wildlings had apparently managed to flee before whatever was hunting them caught them. But the pattern was clear. Something was driving the free folk south, and that something left death in its wake. On the 10th day beyond the wall, they came across a sight that stopped them cold. A village? A real wildling settlement, not just a temporary camp, stood completely empty. 20 or 30 structures built of timber and stone, arranged around a central area where the free folk would have gathered for meetings and celebrations. Benjen had been to this village before, years ago, and remembered it as vibrant and alive, full of the fierce independence that characterized the wildlings. Now it was a tomb. They dismounted and searched the buildings carefully, weapons drawn, but found no one living. No bodies either, which was somehow worse than finding corpses. The wildlings had simply vanished, leaving behind their possessions, their food, their lives. In the central meeting area, they found more of the strange symbols carved into the ground, spirals and circles in patterns that hurt to look at, as though they were wrong somehow, offensive to the natural order. "We should burn this place," one of the rangers muttered. "It feels cursed." Benjen was inclined to agree, but they didn't have time. They needed to push farther north to find the source of whatever was happening out here. They took what supplies they could use, the wildlings wouldn't need them now, and rode on. That night, making camp in a small clearing, Benjen stood the first watch himself. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the snow, turning the world into something from a dream, or a nightmare. He could hear his men breathing in their bedrolls, could smell the horses picketed nearby, but beyond that, nothing. No wolves howling, no nightbirds calling, just silence, deep and complete, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He saw them just after midnight, shapes moving between the trees, pale and silent as falling snow. For a moment, Benjen thought they were wildlings, some scouts who'd noticed the rangers' camp. But then the moonlight caught them fully, and he felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. They were men, or had been once. But they moved wrong, their gait stiff and awkward, and their eyes burned blue, cold and bright as winter stars. They were naked despite the freezing temperature, their skin pale as milk, and when one of them opened its mouth, no breath misted in the air. Dead men, walking dead men with blue eyes that burned with unnatural light. Benjen's hand went to his sword, drawing it with a whisper of steel that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. "To arms!" he shouted. "To arms! We're under attack!" The camp erupted into chaos as the rangers scrambled from their bedrolls, grabbing weapons, trying to form some kind of defensive position. The dead things came on steadily, perhaps a dozen of them, moving with terrible purpose. One of the rangers, a veteran named Hake, charged forward with his sword raised and brought it down on the nearest wight's shoulder. The blade shattered. It shattered like glass striking stone, and the wight reached out with arms that should have been too damaged to function and grabbed Hake by the throat. The ranger's scream was cut short as those dead hands crushed his windpipe, and then the weight was on him, tearing and rending with fingers that were stronger than any living man's. "Fire!" Benjen shouted. "Use fire! Steel won't stop them!" They scrambled to light torches from their campfire, the flames seeming pathetically small against the darkness and the walking dead. But fire worked where steel had failed. When the first burning brand touched dead flesh, the weight went up like kindling, flames spreading across its body with unnatural speed. It made no sound as it burned, just kept trying to move forward, until the fire consumed it completely, and it collapsed into ash. The fight that followed was chaos and horror in equal measure. The rangers fought with torch and flame, burning the wights one by one while trying to avoid their grasping hands. 2 more brothers died, torn apart by dead men who felt no pain and couldn't be stopped by normal weapons. The horses screamed and broke their pickets, fleeing into the night, leaving the rangers stranded. And then, suddenly, it was over. The last weight fell burning to the snow, and the clearing was silent except for the crackle of flames and the harsh breathing of the survivors. 4 rangers remained alive out of 7. 4 men surrounded by burning corpses and the bodies of their brothers, standing in the middle of the haunted forest with no horses and no easy way home. What were those things? Waymar Royce's voice shook, his sword hand trembling despite his efforts to control it. Whites, Benjen said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. The dead, risen and walking. The old stories called them the Others' servants. The Others are real then, the White Walkers, the Cold Gods, all of it. All of it, Benjen confirmed, feeling the weight of that truth settling on his shoulders. 8,000 years the Night's Watch had stood, and for most of that time the realm had thought the Others were myth, legend, children's stories to frighten the weak. But they were real. They were real. And they were active again. And the wildlings were running because they knew what the South had forgotten, that winter was coming, and winter brought death. They spent what remained of the night collecting their dead and burning them. It seemed wrong, somehow, to burn Brothers of the Watch without proper ceremony, but they couldn't risk the bodies rising as whites, and they couldn't carry corpses all the way back to Castle Black on foot. As dawn broke grey and cold over the haunted forest, Benjen made the decision that would define his final days. They were at least 10 days' walk from the wall, assuming they didn't encounter more whites or wildlings, or whatever else might be lurking in these woods. The smart move would be to turn back immediately, to get word to Castle Black that the Others were real and active, and building an army of the dead. But they'd come north to find answers, and Benjen still had questions. How many whites were there? Where were the Others themselves, the creatures who commanded the dead? How far south had they come? The Watch needed that information if they were going to have any chance of preparing an adequate defense. We push north 1 more day, Benjen told his surviving rangers. We need to see what's really out there. Then we run for the wall and warn the realm. They argued, of course, 3 of them against 1. All saying they should turn back now, but Benjen was first ranger, and his word carried weight. 1 more day, just 1 more day to scout ahead, to see what they were really facing. Then they'd retreat, and bring word to those who could actually do something about it. That was the plan. The Others found them on the 2nd day of their retreat south. They came with the evening mist, moving through the fog like whispers of winter made flesh. Tall and pale, inhumanly beautiful, with eyes like blue stars and armor that seemed made of ice itself. 4 of them, riding horses that had been dead for gods, knew how long, carrying blades that smoked with cold even in the freezing air. Benjen and his rangers never had a chance. The first ranger died before he could even draw his sword, an ice blade through his chest, the cold spreading from the wound until his whole body froze solid. The second managed to get his torch up, but one of the others moved with impossible speed and shattered the flame with its blade, then cut the ranger down with casual efficiency. Waymar Royce fought bravely, his sword meeting one of those ice blades in a clash that sent sparks flying. For a moment he held his ground, young and strong and refusing to yield. Then his sword shattered just as Hake's had, and the other drove its blade through his heart. The young lordling died standing, frozen in place, his final expression one of defiance rather than fear. Benjen ran. It wasn't cowardice. It was a necessity. He was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who could carry word back to Castle Black. Someone had to warn the realm. Someone had to tell them that the long night was returning, that the others had come again after 1,000 years of silence. He ran through the haunted forest with the kind of desperate speed that only mortal terror can produce, his breath burning in his lungs, his legs pumping until they screamed for mercy. Behind him, he could hear pursuit, though whether it was the others themselves or just wights he didn't know and didn't look back to check. The forest seemed endless, the trees reaching for him with skeletal branches, the snow trying to trip him with every step. But Benjen knew these woods, had ranged through them for 20 years, and he used that knowledge now. He found a stream and followed it, hoping the running water might hide his scent if wights were tracking him. He climbed trees and dropped to the ground yards away from where he'd gone up, breaking his trail. He did everything Corin Halfhand had ever taught him about evading pursuit. And still, they came. He lost track of time. Hours or days might have passed. He couldn't tell, stopped only when his body literally couldn't continue, collapsing in the snow and forcing himself up again minutes later. He ate snow and kept moving. His ranger's cloak tore on branches. His boots wore through. His hands bled from climbing and grasping at rough bark. But he kept moving south, south toward the wall, south towards safety, south towards the realm that needed warning. The last thing Benjen Stark remembered clearly was seeing the wall in the distance, that pale line of salvation, perhaps 2 days' travel away. He was so close, close enough that he could make it if the others didn't find him first. And then the cold hit him, a cold deeper than anything natural, and the world went white and empty and still. What happened after that, no one knows for certain. Whether Benjen died in that moment or lived, whether the others took him or he escaped into some hidden refuge, whether he became a wight or something else entirely, these questions have no confirmed answers. The Night's Watch searched for him, of course, when he failed to return from his range. But they found only his abandoned camps and the bodies of his rangers, frozen and positioned in that disturbing way that suggested the others had been there. Some believe he died beyond the wall, another casualty of the darkness that was awakening. Others whisper that he survived somehow, transformed by the cold into something neither living nor dead. A few claim they've seen him still ranging beyond the wall, a shadow helping lost brothers of the Watch find their way home. There are even those who insist he became Cold Hands, that mysterious figure who aids the living against the dead. But these are theories, speculation, hopeful legends built on the foundation of an absence. What is known, what can be stated as fact, is this. Benjen Stark rode north on a ranging in the year 298 after Aegon's conquest. He went seeking answers to the mystery of what was driving the wildlings south, and he never returned to Castle Black to share whatever truths he discovered. The realm lost one of its truest defenders that day. The Night's Watch lost its first ranger, a man who'd chosen the Black not because he had no other options, but because he understood that someone had to watch, someone had to remember, someone had to stand against the darkness even when the world had forgotten why the wall existed. Benjen had made his choice 16 years earlier, standing in Winterfell's Godswood, understanding that purpose mattered more than comfort, and duty transcended personal desire. He'd ridden north to the wall and given his life to its service, asking for nothing except the opportunity to do work that mattered. And in the end, he died, or disappeared, or transformed, while doing exactly that, searching for the truth, warning the realm, standing watch one final time against the darkness that gathered in the north. The tragedy wasn't just in his loss, though that was real enough. The tragedy was that the realm he'd tried to warn wouldn't listen. I wouldn't believe it. Wouldn't remember that the wall was built for a reason and the Night's Watch existed for a purpose beyond keeping wildlings in their place. King Robert came north and asked Ned Stark to be his hand, pulling the last Stark lord south into the Game of Thrones, while the true threat gathered beyond the wall. Jon Snow took at the black, as Benjen had hoped, finding his place in the Watch just as his uncle had predicted. And the Seven Kingdoms tore themselves apart in civil war, fighting over crowns and thrones, while Winter came on silent feet, and the others marshalled their army of the dead. Benjen Stark had chosen duty, had chosen honor, had chosen to stand watch over the realms of men, even when those realms had forgotten to be grateful. His fate remains one of the North's great mysteries, a question without answer, a story without ending. But perhaps that's fitting, because the Night's Watch doesn't fight for glory or recognition. They fight because someone has to. They watch because the watching needs to be done. They give their lives in service to a realm that barely remembers they exist, standing between civilization and chaos, between the light and the long dark. Benjen Stark understood that. He'd understood it when he chose the black, understood it when he took his vows, understood it when he rode north on his final ranging. He'd been the watcher on the walls, the sword in the darkness, the shield that guards the realms of men. And whether he died defending that duty, or still serves it in some form beyond understanding, one truth remains: he chose the wall when he could have chosen comfort, chose purpose when he could have chosen ease, and honored the compact house Stark had kept for 8,000 years. Winter came. Someone stood ready. That's what matters. That's what endures. That's the legacy of Benjen Stark's last ride north. Benjen Stark chose the wall when he could have had everything else. His fate remains one of the great mysteries of the North. What do you think happened to him beyond the wall? Drop your theories in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the untold stories of Westeros, hit subscribe. There's always more to uncover in the world of ice and fire.